Now that we've looked at how we modify our effective decision procedure so that we have this mechanical way of deciding for every argument in our categorical logic, whether it's the Aristotelian interpretation or the Boolean interpretation, whether or not that argument is valid, now we're going to turn to an equally important component of our formal system, the translation. Now recall, when we thought about translation, we said, well, I want a simple system. I'm a good logician, so I'm clever and I'm lazy, but I'm also an inferential megalomaniac. I want my system to be as powerful as possible. I want to get the maximum payout for my intellectual effort, and that's where translation comes in. So translation is going to allow us to leverage our formal system and our effective decision procedure for maximal return on our intellectual investment. By learning how to formulate a wider variety of sentences and situations in the simplified language of our formal system, we're going to be able to increase its power without sacrificing any of its simplicity. So the better we are at translation, the more sentences we can translate into our formal system without complicating the system, the more powerful the system is. Now that's a benefit, but it does have a cost because it's difficult sometimes to translate sentences into standard form categorical statements. So Hurley's going to help us by giving us some rules, which are really just heuristic bits of advice that are the benefit of his experience. So every translation that you do should reformulate an English sentence to create an instance in English of one of our standard form categorical statements so that you know exactly how you could take that translated sentence and substitute in capitalized letters and get that English symbol hybrid that is one of those standard form categorical statements. So our final translation should start with one of the three standard form quantifiers, all, no, or some. Now it should be followed by a subject term that picks out a class of things. This is the logic of classes. So all of our logic turns on classes of things. That subject term then should be followed by our copula. We only have two copula, are and are not. So we have to use the copula that's consistent with our quantifier. So if I have are not, my quantifier better be some. Then finally, we'll end with a predicate term, and that term will also pick out a class of things. Now, if you get that far, then 70 or 80% of the time, you're going to have a good translation. Hurley's just here to help us get that last 20, 30%. So these rules are just bits of advice based on his experience in translating English into standard form categorical statements. So here's his first bit of advice. Terms without nouns must be changed to include a noun or a pronoun. So this is the logic of classes of things. And so every term has to pick out a class of things. So say we have this sentence. All lectures are boring. All is a perfectly good quantifier. Lectures is a class of activities. Are is the copula consistent with the quantifier, but boring isn't a class of things. You don't order boring on Amazon. You don't pound down a few borings on the weekend with your friend. You gotta have a class of things. And so we need to change that predicate term, introduce a noun phrase that's consistent with the other term in our sentence. All lectures are, for instance, boring activities. Now we've got a class of things. What about this one? All instructor corrections are annoying. Again, all is a perfectly good quantifier. Instructor corrections, perfectly good class of things. Are, copula consistent with the quantifier. But again, annoying isn't a class of things. Of course, just joking. We could translate this by saying something like, all instructor corrections are annoying intrusions. are annoying ways of stifling my creativity, are annoying and irritating habits, so on. Our next rule is that non-standard verbs must be changed into standard copula. So our logic only has two verbs, are and are not. So whenever we have another verb in English, we're going to have to fold that into the subject term or the predicate term or even both terms. So for instance, suppose we have the following. All people love the Macarena. Doesn't have to be true, it just has to be translatable. So all, perfectly good quantifier. People, that would be a fine class of things, but love the Macarena, that doesn't help us. So we're going to have to change that by folding love into a description of the subject or the predicate term or both. So for instance, we could say all people are people who love the Macarena. Now we've got a subject term and a predicate term that pick out a class of things. We got one of our standard form quantifiers and a copula that's consistent with our quantifier. Wallace moves like a cat. Well, here we don't have a quantifier. Wallace isn't a class of things. Moves doesn't work as a standard copula. So what are we going to do? Well, we might try something like this. All Wallace's movements are movements resembling those of a drunken, retarded cat. So we want to be a little more accurate there maybe, but what we're really doing is moves that verb into both the subject description and the predicate description, and then adding a quantifier. Our next rule is that singular propositions must be changed into class terms. So if we have something like this, Ted thinks it's a beautiful day. Well, Ted isn't a class, and so this is a singular proposition. It talks about a single thing. So what we need to do is change that description so that it's a class that picks out Ted and only Ted, and then make it into a standard form quantifier, copula, and predicate term. So something like this. The person identical to will pick out Ted and only Ted, and so we can change that proposition into all people identical to Ted are people who think it's a beautiful day. Suppose we had something like this. Twitter is an abomination. Again, Twitter's a single thing, and so we're going to want to change it. All companies identical to Twitter are abominations. Now we've got standard form quantifier. The subject term picks out a class of things containing only Twitter, copula consistent with the quantifier, and a predicate term that picks out a class of things.